Well, hey there, guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we got 5 more tips and tricks to make your woodworking just a little bit easier. Now, tips and tricks can be a little bit of a funny thing because some of you may look at the tip that I give or the trick that I give and say, I've been doing that for years. But others may look at that and say, oh my gosh, that is genius. While a whole nother group may say, this guy's a moron. No big deal. Every tip cannot be for every woodworker, and not every woodworker will appreciate every tip. And that's just the way it works. But our first tip today has to do with something that we don't really see very much on my show, and that would be a pin nailer. Well, whether it's a pin nailer or whether it's a brad nailer, they are famous for deflection. And what I mean by that is I just have a couple pieces of scrap here. I'm going to try to do this where I'm not getting in the way of the camera, but you'll try to shoot a nail to adhere a piece of board just like this. And of course that worked perfectly. And right there, do you see this? Right here, we have the nail punched out through the side. Now, this trick doesn't work every time, but it's about 95%. When a nail deflects, chances are it's because you've got your nail gun like this. It deflects from side to side. It very rarely deflects to the front or to the back. So instead of nailing along your line like this, where you can accidentally give it a little bit of extra lean and have that deflection happen, turn your nail gun to the front, just like this. And by doing that, you can minimize the amount of deflection that your nail gun will give. Not one deflection, not on the outside or on the inside. So tip number 1 of the day is, if you're using your nail gun, don't use it in line with your piece where you can get deflection from side to side. Use it perpendicular to the edge of your piece where you'll get a straight shot pretty much all the time. And just as an example there, I just fired nails along the same line. I don't even know how many I fired, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 deflections there. None on the inside, but I've got 5 deflections out the side of my piece of stock. Well, our next tip has to do with veneer, and veneer can be one of the most irritating things to attach to any wooden surface because it's so thin, and we have, in this case, a water-based wood glue. You can get warping. It's hard to clamp down. There's all kinds of different problems. It's hard to get that even clamping to get a nice smooth surface. So I'm going to show you a method here that, well, you can see if it works for you or not. So I have a scrap piece of just pine, just whatever to mount it to, and a small little scrap of veneer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of wood glue here to the veneer. We're going to spread it out in a nice, even, thin layer. You want to make sure that you get all the way to the edges with your glue. Okay, just like that. Got a little part there that wiped off on my finger. All right, and we're going to put that aside. And we'll let that dry. As well, on the surface that you're going to be mounting the veneer, we're going to do the same thing. Just a thin layer of just regular yellow wood glue. This is nothing special. Okay, so there we go. A nice thin layer spread out evenly. And we're going to let both of these surfaces, both the veneer and the surface we're going to mount it to, we're going to let these completely dry. All right, so it has been quite a while. Both of our pieces here are dry. This is the glue side and this is the glue side. They're both 100% dry. And what we have here is a clothes iron. Now this one here is kind of old, but it doesn't matter. It still works. So we're going to use it. So what you want to do is you want to place your glue sides together, just like that. You can now take this iron and iron this down. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but when I first put this down, there was a bit of a curve to that veneer. There was just a slight curve where the glue, the water-based glue had curled it. And that's fine. I mean, it doesn't matter because you're ironing this out now. Guys, look at that. That is now solidly on there. The heat from the iron melts that glue and fuses that together. And, you know, there are a few dark marks here from the iron. We'll just give that a little bit of a sanding, just to get those marks off of there. It's still a little hot. And there we go. Guys, the perfect way to get veneer to stick onto any surface. Now, I could pick at this if I want, but honestly, I can't even get a corner of this up. That is permanently bonded onto there. So for any of your veneer needs, if you want to attach it, put some regular yellow wood glue on both sides, allow it to completely dry, and then get, in my case, my grandmother's iron and iron it on. Guys, it's fantastic. Well, our next tip has to do with accurate table saw setup, and more specifically, setting an accurate height of your blade. Now, guys, the blade is circular, so although I use a digital height gauge, it doesn't matter. Even if you're using setup blocks, you still need to do something in order to make the height an accurate setting. We need the absolute highest point of this blade. And the highest point of the blade is represented by the center of the blade, which is the arbor on your table saw. So if we just set this here, it's a little awkward for me because I'm backwards, so I don't get in the way of the camera. So I'm going to set this to 0, and we're going to put it over our blade, just like that. And I'm going to raise the blade up. And what do we have here? 1 29 1/28. That's fine in this position. But if we are over here, which is about, let's say, we're about an inch out of the way, we are now 1 11/64, considerably less. And if you need a specific height for a dado or a rabbit, that's not going to cut it. That amount of difference could ruin or drastically change the way a project works. So what do you do to ensure that you're always in the middle? Well, you can already see here on my zero clearance insert, I have this very prominent black line. And that black line is representative of the arbor of my table saw. So the first thing you want to do, we'll just raise this up. We're going to remove our blade. So I have my miter fence here, and I have adjusted it so that my fence overhangs my arbor in the bottom of my table saw. And I have a plumb bob. Guys, if you don't have a plumb bob, well, I've made them here on the show. You can always do that. Or even just some washers or a nut tied to the end of a piece of string works as well. So we're just going to lower this here, this plumb bob, till we're just above our arbor. And we want to slide our fence forward or backwards to get us so that we are aligned perfectly with the center of our arbor vertically here. So the point of the plumb bob will be aligned with the very center of our arbor. So I now have a combination square. I'm going to line up with our miter fence slot right with the edge, or the center, I guess in this case, the center of that plumb bob string. And on my table saw right here, I'm just going to place a little pencil mark. It's not going to hurt your table saw. It's not damaged. I mean, you could even scribe that in if you want, because the arbor will never ever move in position from front to back. Even if you're raising the blade, it will always be in the same spot. So now we can get rid of this fence and our plumb bob. And at this point, you don't even have to worry about the blade for now. We can put our insert back in. And using the mark right here on your table saw, we can now transfer that mark with a pencil onto our zero clearance, in my case, insert, and just place it on there. And truth be told, mine's a little off. But at this point now, you want to use a square, line it up across your insert, and you can draw in marker, you can draw it in pencil, pen, whatever you want. You can scribe it, you can laser engrave it, but get a mark on there across your entire insert. And now that line will always be the point that you measure the height of your blade when trying to set it to a specific height. So if you're using a digital gauge, it will be lined up in the very center of that line. That is the highest point of your table saw blade. Now, truth be told, mine was a little off, and that's probably from remarking all of these years that I keep marking, and the line gets thicker and gets a little bit back. I'm actually back here by, I'd say, close to 1/4 of an inch. So I may look into laser engraving mine directly into that insert. But for now, there you go. That is the highest point of your blade, and that is the point that you measure from when you want the most accurate height settings on your table saw. Well, for our next tip, we want to talk about how do you know when your chisels are sharp enough to use for woodworking. There a little while ago on the show, I showed you guys how to make your own sharpening jig. Hopefully some of you took advantage of that. And it puts a great edge on your chisels. But when do you stop? You've seen guys, oh, I can shave with my chisels, and they go and they shave some of the hair off their arm and whatever. Or they cut paper and they show how great it is to cut paper. Guys, the easiest way to dull your chisels is by cutting paper. But let me show you something. Here we have that blank that we placed our veneer on. And I have one of my 1/2-inch chisels, and we're just going to take some of this edge, this corner edge off here. I'm just going to chamfer this with the chisel. Now look at how beautiful that is coming off. It's coming off clean. It is effortless, and it's got a really nice smooth edge to it here. There's no tearing. And is it sharp enough? Well, sure, if you're doing long grain, but that is not the test. What you want to do is you want to test it on the end grain. So let me clamp this in the vise of the bench, and I'm going to show you what I mean. Well, here we have that very same block. In this case, it's just pine, but this can work with any species. You can see where I've cut the chamfer on the one side, and here are the shavings that we cut off. Work great, but guys, I'm going to tell you, a dull chisel can cut long grain as well. So test it on the end grain, and I have the exact same chisel, and we're going to try to cut a chamfer. Now let's just listen to this. Can you hear that? It's kind of got that like that kind of a noise. It's cutting through the fibers of the end grain. We are not getting any tearing here. It's cutting nice and cleanly without tearing. So This is how you can test if your chisels are sharp enough to use for your woodworking. It doesn't matter if you can cut paper. It doesn't matter if you can shave the hairs off your arms. That is not what constitutes sharp. What constitutes sharp when it comes to woodworking is being able to cut end grain cleanly with no tearing. Well, the last thing I want to talk about today is splines when doing miters. Guys, mitering is a great joint. It's great for boxes, picture frames. It has a whole host of uses that you can incorporate it into your projects. The problem with miters is that they're inherently weak. So that is why we add things like our cross brace supports. That is why we add things like splines, and that's what I want to talk about. So you guys have seen me for so many years here on the show. I have a jig that I use that I made here on the program that cuts the splines. It rides over top of my table saw fence, etc., etc. It has fancy clamps and hold downs, and it's quite the outfit. But what if you don't want to make that jig, or you don't have the space to use that jig? Well, I'm telling you, you can do the exact same process as far as adding splines with your biscuit jointer. So let's have a look at that, and I'll show you what you need to do for that. Well, I have a 45-degree joint here that I have cut and glued up and allowed to dry. And it's just for demonstration here, guys. It's not a project, but we'll pretend that it is. So I have my biscuit jointer, and I have it set so that roughly that blade is going to come out and make the spline socket approximately ½ an inch down from the top edge of our, in this case, we'll just call it a box. The first thing you want to do is you want to set the depth of your biscuit, and you need to set it for whatever your thickness is here of your material. I'm using 3/4 of an inch, so I have it set to the number 10. But if you're not sure of your settings, you can just recess your fence, exposing your blade, and just test it against your stock to make sure that you're not going to blow through. Now, if we look here, we have several markings that we can use. Looking in from the back, we have this line right here, which we can utilize to line up with this corner. We have this little window here with our little notch, which we can use to line up with the line of our miter. So we'll line up here with the corner and with the line of our miter, and there we go. We now have this straight on our miter, and all we have to do is turn the biscuit jointer on, and we're going to thrust this into our miter joint. And we can just unclamp this here, and guys, look at that perfect slot. So let's do the other one on the opposite side here. The beauty about doing this is honestly, it provides a perfectly sized slot each and every time because the blade is the exact same thickness. There's no deviation. So let's try this again and see how we make out. And there is our 2 spline slots, both perfectly sized. All you need to do, guys, is glue in your spline material, contrasting or not, and then flush cut it with the edge of your box. So if you don't have these fancy spline jigs that work with your table saw or your router table, but you do have a biscuit jointer, I'm just pointing out that you can still get some really strong joinery using miter joints and splines just with your biscuit jointer. So you don't need anything fancy here. Give it a try. And there you have it. 5 more tips and tricks to make your woodworking day in the shop just a little bit easier. Guys, these tips shows are immensely popular. Everyone is looking for that professional tip, that next edge, that next thing that is going to bring you to the next level, that's going to get you closer to the professionals. And that is why these shows are so popular, because everyone is hungry for that information. But I got to tell you, having tips and tricks is not what makes you a professional. What makes you a professional is the way you conduct yourself in the shop, the safety features that you bring into play in your everyday workflow, and the amount of pride that you take in your pieces to get the workmanship that you want, that makes both you and your potential customer, will say, happy. That is what constitutes a professional. A professional does not mean that you know everything. A professional does not mean that you know all the tricks and all the little, quirks that you can do to make the job easier. That's not a professional. That's experience. There's a difference. So what I'm trying to say here is, it's not a matter of getting these tips and tricks to boost your level of woodworking, because even with the tips and tricks, there is absolutely nothing in the world that can take the place out of common sense and just practice. Practice is what brings you to that next level. It's not a tip, it's not a trick, it's not a way to hide a mistake, it's not a way to cover something up. It is practice. That is the only way to do it. It is the only way to achieve that next level. And until you take the time and the initiative to invest in your hobby, you'll never reach that next level, no matter how many tricks and tips you soak into your knowledge sponge. It just doesn't work that way. But either way, hopefully there are 5 tips and tricks here today that, as you're on that journey of practice, hopefully you can utilize those. You want to make a nice little box, and you know what, I'd love to make splines, but I don't have the jig, and I really don't know if I have the skills to make the jig. But you know what, my dad gave me a biscuit jointer years ago. There's more than one way to achieve everything when it comes to woodworking, guys. And all tips and tricks is a way for you to do it differently than a way that you normally would. Whether or not it's easier, that's for you to decide. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in this week. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. If you found any of this useful at all, give a like and a subscribe. We have an amazing audience base here, and I'm hoping that you're going to consider becoming a part of that. Once again, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the content. I hope you're going to use some of these tips in your shop to make your day a little easier. But more importantly, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.